Let me tell you about a number that almost nobody is putting on the front page, even though it might be one of the quietest, most consequential things happening in the global financial system right now. For 20 months in a row, one of the largest buyers of gold on the planet has walked into the market and bought more. Not a splashy announcement, not a press conference, not a headline scrolling across the bottom of a business channel, just a steady, patient, month-after-month accumulation of the oldest form of money that human beings have ever agreed to trust. And the buyer is China's central bank. Now, stop and think about that for a second, because the sheer boringness of it is exactly what makes it interesting. When a country buys gold once, it's a transaction. When it does it twice, it's a pattern. But when a central bank does it 20 times in a row, month after month, quarter after quarter, through rising prices and falling prices, through good economic news and bad, that isn't a trade anymore. That's a policy. That's a decision made at the very top of a system, and it tells you something about how the people running that system see the future of money itself. And that's the story I want to walk you through today, because once you understand what's actually happening here, not the scary headline version, the real mechanical version, I think you'll see the world a little differently. Here's the thing that caught my attention. We're taught to think of money as this permanent, obvious thing. You've got dollars in your pocket or numbers in an app, and it just works. You hand it over, you get a coffee, the world keeps spinning. But money isn't permanent. It's an agreement. It's the biggest, most invisible agreement in human history, and every few generations that agreement gets rewritten. Somebody decides what backs the money, who gets to print it, whose promise the whole world is willing to trust. And right now, very slowly, very quietly, some of the largest players on Earth appear to be renegotiating the terms of that agreement. 20 straight months of gold buying is one of the clearest signals we have that the negotiation is underway, so let me be clear about what's confirmed and what's interpretation, because that line matters and I'm going to keep drawing it for you the whole way through. The confirmed part is this. China's central bank, the People's Bank of China, has been reporting increases to its official gold reserves for a long stretch of consecutive months. That's not a rumor. That's their own reported data. The interpretation part, what it means, why they're doing it, what it threatens. That's where analysts genuinely disagree, and I'm going to give you both sides honestly, because the doom version and the nothing to see here version are both incomplete, and the truth is somewhere in the tension between them. And then there's a third tier, pure speculation, which is the whisper you'll hear that China is buying far more gold than it officially admits, that the real number could be several times larger, hidden in accounts that never show up in the reports. I'll get to that. But I want you to hold it in the right box in your mind. Estimate, not fact. Because the honest version of this story lives or dies on keeping those three boxes separate. Okay, so why gold? Of all the things a nation could hoard, dollars, euros, oil, farmland, why does this ancient yellow metal keep showing up at the center of the story every single time the global order gets nervous? To answer that, we have to talk about what gold actually is in the plumbing of the financial system, and I promise to do it in plain language, because the jargon is where most people check out, and the jargon is also where the whole thing suddenly makes sense. In simple terms, gold is the one asset a country can own that isn't also someone else's promise, and that distinction is everything. Think about what a dollar in reserves really is. When China holds US dollars, and it holds a mountain of them, it isn't holding wealth in a vault. It's holding a claim. It's holding a promise from the United States that those dollars will still be worth something, that the US won't inflate them away, and, crucially, that the US won't one day decide to freeze them. Same with US government bonds, which are basically dollars that pay a little interest and mature later. Every dollar reserve, every treasury bond, every euro is somebody else's IOU. It has counterparty risk, a fancy way of saying it's only worth what it's worth because someone else keeps their word. Gold is different. Gold sitting in your own vault inside your own borders isn't a promise from anyone. Nobody can freeze it. Nobody can print more of it to dilute what you're holding. Nobody can pass a law in a foreign capital that turns it into a rounding error. It just sits there, dense and boring and stubbornly real, worth roughly the same thing it was worth to a merchant 3,000 years ago. And that is precisely the quality a nervous central bank starts to crave when it looks around and realizes that its enormous pile of foreign reserves is, at the end of the day, a stack of other people's promises. So picture it like this. Imagine two of the biggest countries on earth sitting across a table, and one of them says, "I trust you. Here's my savings, held in your currency, held in your bonds." And for decades, that worked. That was the whole system. But then imagine watching, over the last several years, what happens when relationships between big powers go sour. When one country's reserves, held in another country's currency, suddenly get frozen because of a conflict, cut off with the flick of a policy. If you're sitting on the largest reserve pile in the world, and you just watch that happen to someone else, what's the lesson you take home? The lesson is, promises can be revoked. Vaults cannot. And so, quietly, you start converting a piece of your savings from the kind that depends on someone else's word into the kind that doesn't. That, in the plainest terms I can give you, is the logic that most analysts believe is driving 20 straight months of buying. It's not necessarily about getting rich off a rising gold price. It's about insurance. It's about a country the size of a continent looking at its own savings account and deciding that too much of it is built on trust it no longer fully has, and deciding to fix that one steady monthly purchase at a time without ever saying a dramatic word about it out loud. But here's where it gets genuinely fascinating, because the gold they're buying is only half the story. The other half, the half that actually touches the dollar in your own life, is what they have to sell in order to buy it. And to understand that, we need to slow down and look at what a central bank's reserve pile is actually made of, because most people picture it wrong. When you hear China holds $3 trillion in reserves, you might imagine a warehouse somewhere stacked floor to ceiling with actual cash. That's not it. The overwhelming majority of those reserves aren't dollar bills at all. They're US government bonds, treasuries, because that's what you do with a mountain of dollars. You don't leave them sitting idle. You lend them right back to the United States government, and in exchange you get a piece of paper that says, "We'll pay you back with a little interest on this date." For decades, that was the smartest, safest place on earth to park national savings. It was liquid, it was enormous, it paid you to hold it, and it was backed by the full weight of the world's dominant economy. So now follow the mechanics, because this is the part that actually matters for you. If you want to buy more gold, real, physical gold, sitting in your own vault, you need something to pay for it with. And the thing you have the most of is treasuries. So to shift your savings out of paper promises and into metal, you don't just conjure the money. You sell some of those bonds, you let them mature, and you don't roll them over into new ones. You quietly trim the pile. And here's the reframe I want you to sit with, because it's the whole hinge of this story. The headline is the gold, but the real story isn't what China is buying. The real story is what China is selling to afford it. In simple terms, every ounce of gold moving into that vault is, in part, funded by a treasury bond moving out. And a treasury bond moving out means one less buyer for America's debt. Now, one central bank trimming its holdings on its own doesn't break anything. The US Treasury market is the deepest, most liquid financial market that has ever existed on this planet. Trillions of dollars change hands in it every single day. One country stepping back a little is a ripple, not a wave. But it matters because of what it might signal, and because of who else might be watching and quietly doing the same thing. Here's the thing you have to understand about how the US government actually functions. It spends more than it takes in, every year, by a lot. To cover that gap, it borrows, constantly, by issuing new bonds. And for that whole machine to keep humming smoothly, somebody has to show up and buy those bonds at reasonable prices. For a very long time, foreign central banks, China chief among them, were among the most reliable, most consistent buyers in the room. They had oceans of dollars from selling goods to the world, and they recycled those dollars straight back into American debt. It was a beautiful, self-reinforcing loop. China sold you cheap goods, took your dollars, and lent those dollars right back to your government, which helped keep American interest rates low, which helped you borrow cheaply for your house and your car. So picture that loop starting to loosen. Picture one of the biggest, steadiest buyers in the room not slamming the door, but easing toward the exit, buying a little less, letting a little more mature and walk away, redirecting the proceeds into a metal that pays no interest at all but answers to nobody. It's a whisper, not a shout. But whispers in a market this size can be heard. Because if the most reliable foreign buyer is stepping back, and demand for those bonds softens even at the margin, then to keep attracting buyers, the price of the bonds has to fall a little, which is the same thing as saying the interest rate on them has to rise. And the interest rate on US government debt is the gravitational center of the entire financial universe. It's the number that quietly sets the cost of your mortgage, your credit card, your car loan, the rate on the money your own government borrows in your name. That's why this obscure central bank behavior, this boring monthly gold purchase that never makes the front page, reaches all the way down into your kitchen. Not because gold is glamorous, but because the flip side of buying gold, the selling, touches the price of American debt, and the price of American debt touches almost everything you'll ever borrow. It's a chain, metal into a vault, bonds out of a portfolio, one fewer buyer at the auction, upward pressure on rates, and eventually maybe a slightly more expensive world for anyone who owes money, which, in America, is nearly everyone. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the kind of story that gets stretched into something it isn't. Nobody is claiming China dumped all its treasuries overnight. They didn't. The reduction has been gradual, spread over years, and China still holds a colossal amount of American debt, hundreds of billions of dollars worth. This is a slow drift, not a fire sale. But drift is the point. Central banks don't move in dramatic gestures. They move like glaciers, imperceptibly, until one day you look at the map and the coastline has changed. And when you line up the two trends side by side, 20 straight months of adding gold, and a multi-year pattern of quietly holding fewer treasuries, a shape starts to emerge that's hard to unsee. It looks less like a series of unrelated decisions and more like a single strategy, executed patiently, in near silence, right out in the open where nobody bothered to look. And this brings us to the question that turns this from a finance story into a history story, because the thing is, this exact move, a rising power deciding it no longer fully trusts the reserve system built by the dominant power and quietly reaching for gold as the exit, has happened before. It happened once in living memory, and when it did, it broke the entire architecture of global money in a single afternoon. To understand where this road might lead, you have to understand where it led the last time somebody walked it. So let me take you back to a warm August night, more than 50 years ago, when a president went on television and, in a few short sentences, ended the world's relationship with gold and reset the rules of money for everyone alive today. The year was 1971. For nearly 3 decades, the world's money had run on a promise made at a resort in New Hampshire called Bretton Woods, back in the closing years of the Second World War. The deal was elegant on paper. The American dollar would sit at the center of the global system, and the dollar itself would be anchored to gold at a fixed price, $35 an ounce. Every other currency would then pin itself to the dollar. So in simple terms, the dollar was as good as gold, and everyone else's money was as good as the dollar. It was a pyramid, and gold was the stone at the bottom holding the whole thing up. For a while, it worked beautifully. But here's the crack that formed underneath it. As the decades passed, America printed and spent more dollars than it had gold to back. Wars, social programs, a booming consumer economy, all of it funded with more paper than the vaults in Fort Knox could honestly cover. And the countries holding those dollars, particularly in Europe, started to notice. They started to do the math. And they started to get nervous. Now picture the imagined conversation happening in the finance ministries of the world at that time, because this is really the heart of it. A French official looks at his pile of American dollars and says, in effect, "You promised me these are worth gold, $35, 1 ounce, so I'd like the gold now, please." And he sends ships. He literally sends ships across the Atlantic to haul American gold back to Paris. And then another country does the same, and another. It becomes a quiet run, not on a bank, but on a nation. The world was calling America's bluff, redeeming paper for metal, and the vaults were emptying faster than anyone wanted to admit out loud. So on a Sunday evening in August of 1971, the American president went on television, interrupting the country's favorite show, and told the world that the United States would no longer honor that promise. The gold window, as they called it, was closed. You could keep your dollars, but you could no longer trade them for American gold. In a handful of sentences, the anchor was cut. The stone at the bottom of the pyramid was pulled out, and somehow, this is the strange part, the pyramid didn't collapse. It just started floating. That's the moment the money in your wallet became what it is today. From that night forward, the dollar wasn't backed by anything you could hold. It was backed by trust. Trust in the American government, the American economy, the American military, and the simple fact that everybody else agreed to keep using it. Economists have a polite name for this. They call it fiat money, from the Latin, meaning roughly, let it be so. Money because we say it's money, and for over 50 years now, we've all agreed to say so. But here's why that ancient history matters tonight, in a way that should make the hair stand up on the back of your neck. The 1971 crisis happened because the countries holding America's paper stopped trusting it and reached for the one thing that needed no promise behind it. They reached for gold. Gold is the asset that carries no counterparty. It isn't somebody else's IOU. It doesn't depend on a foreign government keeping its word, or a foreign central bank staying solvent, or a distant politician not doing something reckless. It just sits there, being gold, unbothered by whose flag is flying that decade. When a nation loses faith in the system, gold is the lifeboat it has always climbed into. So now go back to the pattern we've been tracing. 20 straight months of a rising power adding gold to its vaults. A multi-year quiet trim of the paper it holds from the dominant power. Ask yourself what that behavior would look like from the outside, if you'd never seen it before, if you'd only read about 1971 in a history book. It would look like the early, patient chapters of exactly the same story, a country doing the math on somebody else's promises and deciding, slowly, calmly, without sending any ships, to keep a little more of its wealth in the one thing that needs no promise at all. Now, I have to slow us down here, because this is the exact spot where a story like this can run off the rails into pure drama, and I don't want to do that to you. There are enormous differences between then and now, and they matter. In 1971, currencies were legally pinned to gold. There was a formal promise to break. Today there is no such promise. The dollar floats freely, and gold is just one asset among many that a central bank can choose to hold. China isn't redeeming anything. There's no window to close. Nobody is showing up at the treasury with a wheelbarrow demanding metal, so the mechanism is not identical, and anyone who tells you it's 1971 all over again is selling you a feeling, not an analysis. But the human logic underneath, the reason a nation reaches for gold in the first place, that hasn't changed in 5,000 years, and that's the thread worth holding on to. Not the prediction, the pattern. The instinct of a large, ambitious country to reduce its dependence on a system it doesn't control, and to store some of its power in a form that no foreign government can freeze, sanction, or inflate away. Because, and this is the part almost nobody was talking about while it was happening, the freezing part isn't hypothetical anymore. In recent years, the world watched another major power have a huge chunk of its foreign reserves frozen almost overnight, locked up in accounts it could no longer touch, because those reserves were held in someone else's currency, inside someone else's system. And every central banker on earth took a very careful note of what happened. The lesson landed instantly, and it landed hard. Dollars held abroad are only yours as long as the country that issues them lets them be yours. Gold in your own vault is yours no matter what anyone decides in a distant capital. That single realization may be the quiet engine behind this whole 20-month streak, not a plot to destroy the dollar. Something colder and more practical than that, a hedge against the possibility that your own savings could be switched off. And once you see the buying through that lens, as insurance rather than aggression, the timeline of the last 2 years starts to read very differently. Because it isn't just China doing it, and the moment you realize how many other countries have quietly joined the same movement is the moment this stops looking like a story about one nation and starts looking like a story about a slow, global loss of faith in the old arrangement. So let me widen the lens all the way out, because this is where it gets genuinely interesting. China isn't buying in a vacuum. Look at the central banks of the world as a group, and something remarkable shows up in the numbers. For decades, the official sector, that's central banks collectively, was actually a net seller of gold. They saw it as a relic, dead weight, a barbarous metal that paid no interest and just sat in a vault costing money to guard. Then, somewhere in the last stretch of years, that flipped hard. Central banks as a group started buying gold at a pace not seen in generations, adding well over 1,000 tons a year, 2 years running. Not just China. Central banks across Asia, the Middle East, and the emerging world, all reaching for the same thing at the same time, quietly, without press conferences. When everybody independently decides to buy the same insurance policy in the same window, that's not a coincidence. That's a signal that a lot of serious people, looking at their own risks, arrived at the same uncomfortable conclusion. And here's the Steelman I promised you, because I refuse to leave you with only the scary version. None of this means the dollar is finished. It really doesn't. The dollar is still, by a wide margin, the most used currency on the planet. The overwhelming majority of global reserves are still held in dollars. Gold is climbing, but it's climbing from a small share, not overtaking anything yet. Most international trade is still invoiced and settled in dollars. The deepest, most liquid financial market on earth is still the US Treasury market, and there is no replacement waiting in the wings that can absorb the world's savings the way it does. The yuan is nowhere close, precisely because China keeps such tight control over its own currency that other countries don't fully trust it as a store of value. You can't be the world's reserve currency and a closed capital system at the same time. So the honest read is not, the dollar is dying. The honest read is, the dollar is being diversified away from, slowly, at the margins, by countries that want an exit that doesn't depend on Washington's permission. Slow, marginal, but steady, and steady over 20 months adds up. So what does this actually mean for the system? And I want to be crystal clear, this is macro and geopolitical analysis, not financial advice, and I'm not here to tell you what to do with a single dollar you own. What it means is this: the world is quietly building optionality. It's not abandoning the current order, it's buying itself a back door. And the variables worth watching are specific, so you can track this yourself instead of taking anyone's word for it. Watch whether the central bank buying continues once the price of gold gets uncomfortable. Insurance you keep buying even when it's expensive tells you it's real conviction, not opportunism. Watch whether China ever loosens its grip on the yuan, because a currency you can freely move in and out of is the only kind the world will ever trust at scale. Until that happens, the dollar's throne is safe. Watch the share of global reserves held in dollars versus everything else. That ratio, drifting 1% or 2% a year, is the actual scoreboard, not the headlines. and watch whether more countries start settling trade with each other directly, skipping the dollar as the middleman, because that's the plumbing that would have to change for any of this to become structural rather than symbolic. Because here's the thing I keep coming back to, the thing that made me want to tell you this story in the first place. 20 months. Almost 2 years, month after month after month. A country adding to a hoard of the oldest money humans have ever agreed on, and it barely made a ripple in the news. We were all watching the loud stuff, the elections, the rate cuts, the tech launches, the daily noise. And underneath it all, in the vaults, someone was very patiently, very quietly voting with their reserves. Not a coup, not a collapse. Just a long, deliberate hedge against a future they're not sure they trust. The battle over what money is and who controls it doesn't always look like a war. Sometimes it looks like a spreadsheet with a number that ticks up and up and up while nobody's paying attention. And maybe that's the real lesson here, that the biggest shifts in the financial world almost never announce themselves. They don't collapse, they creep. They happen in the space between the headlines, in the boring monthly reports nobody reads, and by the time everyone agrees it's a story, it's already old news to the people who were doing it. So I want to hand this one to you, because your read is genuinely as good as mine. Here's my question, and I really do want the answer in the comments. Do you think this 20-month gold streak is China quietly building an escape hatch from the dollar, insurance against getting frozen out? Or is it something bigger, the first slow step toward actually challenging the dollar's crown? And what's the one variable you'd watch to tell the difference? Drop it below. I read these, and the sharpest comment on this channel usually comes from someone who spotted the thing I missed. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. I know it's a lot to think about. Take care of yourself, be kind to somebody today, and I'll see you in the next one.